was a cold Monday morning when Daniel Brooks stood quietly in the courtroom, shivering in his old torn jacket. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The walls were painted dull beige and the benches were filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. Some were lawyers checking their watches, some were officers standing tall with firm faces, and a few were there out of curiosity, whispering softly as they looked at the man in the front. Daniel kept his head low. His hands were rough and trembling, his fingernails dark with dirt, his face tired and lined from nights without sleep. He had been on the streets for so long that warmth had become a distant memory. He was there because he had been caught behind a grocery store, searching for food in the trash bins. The store manager had called the police and Daniel had not argued or resisted. He simply stood there silent when the officers arrived. Now he stood in front of a judge waiting to hear what would happen to him. His public defender, a young woman with short hair and a kind smile, whispered something to him before the hearing started. Daniel nodded, though his mind felt far away. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood made everyone straighten up. Judge Richard Hale sat high above them, his black robe neatly pressed, his glasses reflecting the light from the large window behind him. He had been a judge for many years, known for being fair but strict. He looked down at Daniel's file, flipping through the papers slowly. Another case, another name, another life tangled in hardship, he thought. Still, something about this man caught his attention. Maybe it was the way Daniel stood, not angry or careless, but quietly patient, as if he had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. The bailiff called Daniel's name. Case of Daniel Brooks, charged with trespassing and unlawful entry. The words echoed in the silent courtroom. Daniel looked up briefly, then down again. The judge began the usual questions in his steady voice. "Mr. Brooks, do you have a permanent address?" Daniel shook his head. His voice was soft when he spoke. "No, sir. Where have you been staying?" the judge asked. "Under the old train bridge," Daniel replied quietly. The courtroom stirred. Some people looked away, others frowned, a few whispered to each other. The judge continued. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Daniel nodded again. "Yes, sir. You were found behind the grocery store on East Maple Street, correct?" "Yes, sir. I wasn't stealing. I just needed something to eat." His voice trembled, but he spoke with honesty. The judge stopped writing for a moment and looked up at him. Daniel's words were simple, yet they carried something heavy, something real. From the gallery, a woman in a blue coat whispered to the person beside her. "He looks so lost," she said softly. Another man replied, "They all say the same thing." The bailiff turned to silence them. Daniel didn't seem to notice. He was staring at his shoes, his mind drifting back to the night he was arrested. He remembered the cold ground, the rain soaking through his thin clothes, the flashing red and blue lights, and the officer's tired sigh as he said, "You can't stay here, buddy." Daniel hadn't fought back. He simply nodded and went along, knowing that arguing never changed anything. The young public defender stood and began to speak on his behalf. "Your Honor, Mr. Brooks has no criminal record. He's been living without shelter for several years after losing his job and home. He was not violent and he did not resist arrest. He was simply trying to survive." The judge listened, tapping his pen against the desk. He had heard these words before many times, but this time something about the man before him felt different. Daniel stood silently, his eyes fixed on the table. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly. The judge studied him for a long moment, noticing the wrinkles on his forehead, the hollow cheeks, the calm in his eyes. Then his gaze fell on Daniel's jacket. It was old, faded, but carefully patched in a few places, as if someone had once tried to keep it in good shape. On the left side of the chest, pinned just above the pocket, was a small metal piece, a medal. The dull bronze color caught the judge's eye. He leaned forward a little, squinting. It wasn't a pin or a decoration. It was military, a service medal. Most people wouldn't recognize it, but Judge Hale had seen it before. He didn't say anything yet, only glanced at it again as he turned a page in the file. "Mr. Brooks," the judge said after a pause, "how long have you been without a home?" Daniel took a moment before answering. "Almost 5 years, sir." His tone was calm, without anger or bitterness. "And before that?" the judge asked. Daniel swallowed. "I had a job at a construction site. I worked there for a few years, but then the company shut down and I hurt my leg. Couldn't keep up after that." His voice faded. "I tried finding other work, but no one was hiring a man like me." Things just got worse. The judge wrote a few notes. He could feel the weight in Daniel's words. The man wasn't making excuses. He wasn't blaming anyone. He was simply telling the truth. That quiet honesty made the courtroom still. The young public defender looked at Daniel with sympathy, while the prosecutor kept his eyes on his file, unmoved. Outside, a gust of cold wind pushed against the tall windows, making them rattle slightly. The courtroom heater buzzed softly, filling the silence between words. Daniel stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his shoulders tense. He wasn't used to being looked at this way, like someone's story was being read out loud. He just wanted it to end. The judge sighed softly. "Mr. Brooks, the law says I must consider the act, not just the reason. But I also believe in fairness." Daniel looked up, his tired eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. For a brief second, something passed between them, a spark of understanding. The judge saw not just a man who had trespassed, but a man who had lived through too much and still stood with quiet dignity. The judge's pen paused again. His eyes drifted back to the medal. He couldn't help but wonder why a man living under a bridge would still wear a soldier's medal on his chest. It didn't fit the picture of a drifter or a thief. It belonged to someone who once had purpose, someone who had done something meaningful. The prosecutor began reading from the police report, his voice flat and steady. The defendant was found at approximately 11:40 p.m. behind the East Maple grocery store. He was not in possession of any stolen property. He was compliant with officers and expressed remorse for being there. When the prosecutor finished, the judge nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. He turned his eyes back to Daniel. "Is there anything you'd like to say before I make my decision?" Daniel hesitated. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. Finally, he said quietly, "I didn't mean any harm, sir. I was just cold and hungry. That's all." The room stayed silent for several seconds. The judge felt something stir in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of compassion mixed with recognition. He didn't show it on his face, but inside a small piece of his heart softened. He looked at Daniel again, at the dull metal that still gleamed faintly under the courtroom light, and a memory flickered in his mind, one he hadn't thought about in years. He didn't say anything yet. He simply cleared his throat and said, "We'll continue in a moment." The gavel struck the desk softly, and the court went into a brief recess. Daniel sat down slowly, feeling the wooden bench creak beneath him. He exhaled deeply, unaware that the small medal on his jacket had just changed the way the judge saw him. The hum of voices returned to the room as people began to whisper again, but Daniel didn't listen. He sat quietly, staring at the floor, lost in thought. He didn't know that this morning his life was about to take a turn he never expected. Sometimes fate speaks softly, not with loud events, but through small things, a worn medal, a quiet memory, a second glance. And for Daniel Brooks, that moment had just begun. When the recess ended, the courtroom slowly filled again with the sound of footsteps and murmurs. The judge returned to his seat, his face calm but thoughtful. Daniel Brooks stood once more in front of the bench, his shoulders slightly hunched, holding his worn cap in his hands. He looked tired but polite, waiting quietly as the bailiff called the court to order. Everyone went silent again, and the soft hum of the heater was the only sound for a moment. Judge Richard Hale adjusted his glasses and looked at Daniel carefully. Something about the man's stillness caught his attention again, the kind of quiet that came from years of struggle, not from arrogance or anger. The judge began with a firm but even tone. "Mr. Brooks, before we continue, I want to understand your situation clearly. You said earlier you've been living under the train bridge for 5 years, correct?" Daniel nodded, his eyes on the floor. "Yes, sir. I try to stay out of sight. I don't want trouble. It's just a place where the wind doesn't cut so bad." His voice was low, but his words were steady. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. "And during this time you haven't received any help from local shelters or veteran services?" Daniel looked uncertain for a moment. "I tried once. They were full that night. I stopped going after that. Sometimes when you've been out there too long, people stop looking at you the same way. You start to feel like you don't belong anywhere anymore." His words carried a quiet sadness that made even the clerk pause from typing. The young public defender, who had been watching Daniel carefully, stood and added softly, "Your Honor, Mr. Brooks has no family left in this area. His parents passed away several years ago. He has no prior convictions, no history of violence, and according to police, he was fully cooperative when they found him. He simply wanted something to eat. The judge nodded slowly. I understand. He looked down at the file again, though his eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the papers. He asked, Mr. Brooks, do you have any identification? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, creased ID card. The corners were bent and the picture was faded, but it was still readable. The judge took a moment to look at it. Daniel looked much younger in the photo, clean-shaven, healthy, with clear eyes. It was hard to believe this was the same man standing before him now. The prosecutor cleared his throat and began reading the official report again, his tone flat and professional. Your Honor, while the defendant's background is unfortunate, the law states that trespassing on private property, especially after closing hours, is still a violation. The store owner is requesting community service as compensation. He believes a warning isn't enough. The judge listened but said nothing. He could feel the weight of the prosecutor's words, but his attention kept drifting to the medal pinned to Daniel's jacket. The medal caught the light again, faintly glowing against the worn fabric. Finally, the judge spoke quietly. Mr. Brooks, that medal you wear, where did it come from? Daniel froze. His hand instinctively brushed over the medal, almost as if he wanted to hide it. For a second, he looked unsure of what to say. Then he whispered, It's from my service, sir. The judge tilted his head slightly. Service? Daniel nodded. Yes, sir. I was in the army. Long time ago. His eyes softened, distant now, as if he were seeing another place entirely. I was with the 5th Infantry Division, Afghanistan, Kandahar. The room went quiet. Even the prosecutor lowered his papers slightly. The judge's expression changed almost immediately. The name Kandahar struck a deep chord within him. He had once represented veterans at a legal aid office when he was a young lawyer. He remembered stories from that region, stories of bravery and loss. He had heard of soldiers who came back different, carrying invisible burdens no one could see. How long did you serve? The judge asked gently. Daniel hesitated. Almost 6 years. I joined when I was 21. Got injured in my last year. Came back home with a bad leg and a mind that couldn't rest. He smiled faintly but without joy. Things never felt the same after that. The judge nodded slowly, a mix of recognition and regret on his face. You were awarded that medal for bravery? Daniel shrugged slightly. It was for helping a few men get out after an ambush. We lost some, but we made it out. I didn't do it for a medal. I just wanted my team to go home. The quiet in the courtroom grew heavier. Everyone seemed to sense that something important was unfolding. The prosecutor closed his file completely now, realizing this case wasn't as simple as it had seemed. The public defender looked at Daniel with deep respect, her eyes shining slightly. The judge leaned forward, his voice softer than before. Mr. Brooks, I want to thank you for your service. What you did matters. Daniel looked up for the first time, meeting the judge's eyes. Thank you, sir. I just wish I could have done more. His words hung in the air like a whisper carried by wind. The judge looked thoughtful for a long moment. He remembered a time years ago when he had attended a veterans ceremony at the courthouse lawn. He had met a group of soldiers then, some proud, some broken, all trying to fit back into a world that had moved on without them. He wondered if Daniel had been one of them, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, unseen. Mr. Brooks, the judge finally said, what happened after you returned? Daniel hesitated, looking down again. I tried to work, sir. I really did. I got a job at a factory, but my leg didn't heal right and the pain got worse. I started missing days. They let me go after a while. I tried to find other work, but it's hard when you walk with a limp and can't lift heavy things. One thing led to another and I ran out of money. I lost my apartment. After that, I just didn't have anywhere else to go. The judge could see the embarrassment in Daniel's eyes. It wasn't self-pity. It was quiet shame, the kind of pain carried by people who used to stand tall but now had nowhere left to turn. The judge took a slow breath and said, You didn't reach out for help through the veterans office? Daniel shook his head. I tried once. Filled out the forms. They said they'd call me. I waited. They never did. He gave a tired shrug. After a while, you stop expecting things to get better. You just try to survive the day. A long silence filled the room. The judge leaned back, resting his hands on the desk, his expression unreadable. Then he said softly, "Mr. Brooks, sometimes people fall through the cracks. That doesn't mean they're forgotten." Daniel's lips trembled slightly, but he said nothing. He stood there, still as stone, the metal on his jacket glinting faintly in the light. For the first time in a long while, someone had spoken to him not like a case number, not like a problem, but like a person. The judge looked at the file again, then at Daniel. "You said earlier you didn't mean any harm. I believe that. You weren't trying to break the law. You were trying to stay alive." Daniel nodded quietly, unable to find words. The judge tapped his pen on the desk, thinking. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if everyone inside was holding their breath. Finally, Judge Hale said, "I'll need a few minutes before I make a decision. Mr. Brooks, please remain seated." Daniel returned to his bench slowly. His leg ached, but he didn't complain. He just sat there, his hands resting on his lap, staring at the floor. Across the room, the judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, his thoughts heavy. He knew this case was different. The man sitting before him wasn't a criminal. He was someone the world had forgotten. A man who had once served with honor, now standing alone against life's coldness. As the judge looked again at the dull metal shining faintly in the dim courtroom light, he felt something stir deep within him. He realized that justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about remembering the stories behind the faces that passed through his courtroom. And for the first time in a long while, Judge Richard Hale began to see that this case might not end with a sentence, but with a second chance. The courtroom was still. Everyone waited for Judge Hale to speak, but he didn't right away. He kept looking at Daniel Brooks and then again at the small medal on his jacket. Something about it stirred a memory deep inside him, a moment from long ago that refused to fade. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes thoughtful and distant. It wasn't often that a simple courtroom hearing could make him feel like time had stopped. But right now he couldn't shake the feeling that this case meant something more than what was written on paper. "Finally," he said quietly, "Mr. Brooks, that medal you wear, it looks familiar to me." Daniel blinked in surprise. His fingers brushed over the metal piece again as if making sure it was still there. "It's an old one, sir," he said softly. "I've had it a long time." The judge's voice lowered. "That's the Bronze Star, isn't it?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. May I ask," the judge continued gently, "how you came to receive it?" Daniel hesitated. His eyes grew distant as if he were looking far beyond the courtroom walls. "It was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Kandahar, 2006, we were on patrol and things went bad fast. There was an ambush near the convoy route. I got separated from my team, but I managed to get 2 of my men out before the fire reached the trucks. That's all it was." He paused, his voice barely above a whisper. "Others didn't make it." The room went silent. No one moved or spoke. Even the prosecutor, who had been ready to continue with his papers, stopped and looked at Daniel with new eyes. The judge sat very still. He remembered that mission. He remembered reading about it years ago. His brother had served in the same area around that time. The story had been in the newspapers. An unnamed sergeant had pulled 2 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy danger. The name had never stuck with him then, but now it returned clear as day. "Sergeant Brooks," the judge said quietly. "You were that man." Daniel looked up, startled. "I was one of many, sir. I just did what anyone would have done." The judge nodded slowly, his voice soft. "Not everyone would have done it, Mr. Brooks. I remember reading about that mission. You saved lives." Daniel said nothing. He looked down again, uncomfortable with the attention. He had never liked talking about that day. Too many memories lived behind that medal. Faces, sounds, and things he didn't want to remember. He wore it not out of pride, but out of something else. A reminder. A small piece of who he used to be before everything fell apart. The judge closed the folder in front of him. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I think we need to talk about what happened after that. I believe there's more to your story than what's written here." Daniel shifted uneasily, not sure if he wanted to explain. He had told parts of his life before, to shelters, to strangers, to social workers, but it always ended the same way. People listened for a few minutes, nodded, and moved on. But the look in the judge's eyes now was different. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. After a long pause, Daniel spoke again. "When I came home, I thought everything would go back to normal. But it didn't. I had trouble sleeping. Loud noises made me jump. I'd wake up at night thinking I was still over there. I couldn't keep a steady job. I tried to work construction again, but my leg wasn't strong anymore and my mind wasn't either. He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. It's strange, sir. You spend years trying to stay alive out there, and when you come back, you can't figure out how to live anymore. The courtroom stayed quiet. The judge didn't interrupt. He just listened, his hands folded. Daniel continued, his voice calm but heavy. I used to have a small apartment near the river. It wasn't much, but it was mine. When I couldn't work anymore, the bills piled up. I sold what I could, but it wasn't enough. One day I came home and found my things outside the door. After that, I slept in my truck for a while, then under bridges, parks, anywhere out of the rain. I kept the medal with me, not because it meant honor, but because it reminded me that once I wasn't invisible. Something about those last words hit the judge deeply. He had seen countless people come through his courtroom, people who had made mistakes, people who gave up. But Daniel's story wasn't about crime. It was about loss and survival. The young public defender, standing to the side, spoke gently. Your Honor, I believe this man deserves help, not punishment. He's not a threat to anyone. He just needs someone to see him again. The judge nodded but didn't reply right away. He looked at Daniel again, studying his tired face, his steady posture, the way he spoke with quiet respect even after everything he'd been through. Then he turned to the bailiff. Please bring me the service record of Mr. Brooks from the Veterans Registry. I want confirmation. As the bailiff left, the judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Brooks, when was the last time someone thanked you for what you did? Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. It's been a long time, sir, he said after a moment. Most people don't ask about the past. They just see what's in front of them, a man without a home. The judge looked down for a moment, thinking about how easy it was for society to forget its heroes once the noise faded. He remembered his brother's words years ago. The hardest battle starts when you come home. After a few minutes, the bailiff returned with a printed record. The judge read through it silently. His eyes stopped on one line. Sergeant Daniel Brooks, Bronze Star recipient, honorably discharged, 1007. He exhaled slowly, then placed the paper on the desk. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but filled with emotion. Mr. Brooks, you've already done more for this country than most of us ever will. I can't ignore that. You may have lost your home, but you haven't lost your worth. Daniel's eyes grew wet, though he blinked quickly to hold it back. For years he had felt unseen, like a shadow moving through the world. Hearing those words broke something open inside him. Thank you, sir, he said softly. The judge cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. The law has rules, but justice has a heart. I won't treat this case as a crime. You didn't break into that store to hurt anyone. You did it because you were hungry. And that's not a sin, it's a struggle. The prosecutor stood up slowly, his tone more cautious now. Your Honor, while I understand the situation, we can't simply dismiss the charge without process. The judge nodded. I'm aware. That's why I'll take this matter under review. But I want you to remember that not every man in this courtroom is defined by his mistakes. The prosecutor nodded respectfully, realizing the conversation was no longer about legal rules. It was about compassion. Daniel stood there, unsure what to say. The judge leaned forward one last time. Mr. Brooks, I want to ask you something. If I could help arrange support, housing, food, a place where you can rebuild your life, would you accept it? Daniel's lips trembled slightly as he whispered, Yes, sir, I would. The judge smiled faintly the first time that morning. Good. Then maybe today isn't just another hearing. Maybe it's a new start. The room remained silent as Daniel was escorted out of the courtroom to wait in the side hall. The people in the gallery sat quietly. Many of them moved in ways they didn't expect. The prosecutor stared at his notes, no longer sure what to say. The young public defender wiped a tear from her eye, pretending to look at her file. Judge Hale watched the door close behind Daniel and let out a long breath. He had seen countless faces pass through his courtroom, but this one would stay with him. He looked down at the copy of the record, at the simple line that proved what he already knew, that the man the world saw as broken was once a hero. He sat there for a long time, thinking. Some cases changed your view of the law, others changed your view of life. And as the quiet filled the courtroom again, Judge Hale realized that this was one of those moments that would stay with him forever. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet. Daniel sat on a wooden bench near the wall, his hands folded in his lap, his old cap resting beside him. The guard standing near the door kept glancing at him, unsure how to treat him now that the truth about his past had come out. Daniel didn't notice the looks. He was lost in thought. The echo of the judge's voice still lingered in his mind, words that sounded kinder than anything he had heard in years. For the first time in a long time, someone had called him by his full name with respect, not pity. He could still hardly believe it. He stared down at the metal pinned to his jacket. The edges were worn smooth after years of rubbing against the fabric. He remembered the day he got it, the noise of the base, the line of soldiers standing under the bright sun, his commanding officer shaking his hand. He hadn't wanted to stand there. He had felt guilty that day, not proud. Too many faces were missing from that ceremony. He had carried the medal ever since, not as a trophy, but as a promise. A reminder that even when everything fell apart, he had once done something that mattered. Inside the courtroom, Judge Richard Hale was pacing behind his desk. He had asked for a brief pause before making his decision, but the truth was he was thinking about more than just the law. He was thinking about all the years he had spent behind that bench, reading files filled with names and crimes, deciding punishments and fines. Most of those names blurred together over time. But Daniel Brooks was different. This was not a man trying to escape responsibility. This was a man who had fallen through the cracks of a world too busy to notice. The judge remembered his own father, a veteran of an old war who had once told him, "Son, when you wear the uniform, you carry the weight of others on your shoulders. When you take it off, the world forgets what that weight feels like." Those words had stayed with him, buried deep until this very morning. He sat back down, staring at Daniel's file. Everything on paper looked ordinary. A trespassing charge, no prior record, no fixed address. But behind those few lines was a whole life, one filled with service, sacrifice, and quiet suffering. The judge took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. For years he had believed that justice was about rules, about balance, but today it felt more like a test of the heart. After several minutes, he called the bailiff. "Bring Mr. Brooks back in, please." When Daniel re-entered the room, it was quieter than before. The people in the gallery watched silently as he stood at his place. The young public defender gave him a small nod of encouragement. The judge looked up, his expression calm but kind. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for your patience," he said. "Before I make any decision, I'd like to ask you a few more questions." Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir. Since your time in service, have you had any contact with other veterans organizations? Any friends or old teammates who've helped you?" Daniel shook his head. "Most of the men I served with went their own ways, sir. Some didn't come home. I kept to myself after I left. I thought I could manage alone. Do you want to get help now?" the judge asked gently. Daniel hesitated. "I don't know, sir. I've tried before. Sometimes people make promises and forget. I guess I stopped expecting much." The judge leaned forward. "Not everyone forgets, Mr. Brooks." His voice was steady, but there was warmth in it. "I've spoken with the Veterans Outreach Office. They can help you with a place to stay, meals, and even counseling. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Daniel looked up, a little startled. "You spoke to them already?" The judge gave a small smile. "Yes, during the recess I called them myself." A quiet gasp spread through the courtroom. It wasn't common for a judge to personally reach out like that. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He tried to blink away. "Sir, I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," the judge replied softly. "You've said enough." There was a moment of silence, the kind that carries meaning without words. The prosecutor sat down slowly, realizing there was nothing left to argue. The young defender's hands trembled slightly as she closed her notebook. The judge continued, his tone gentle but firm. "Mr. Brooks, the law says I can sentence you to community service for trespassing. But I believe you've already served this country in ways most of us never will. Instead, I'm ordering that you be placed under a veteran rehabilitation program. They'll help you find stable housing and medical care." Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You mean, I won't go to jail?" The judge shook his head. "No, Mr. Brooks, jail is for those who choose to harm others. You didn't harm anyone. You just needed to survive." For a long moment, Daniel couldn't speak. His throat tightened as emotions he had buried for years started to rise. The courtroom stayed quiet, everyone watching the exchange like it was something sacred. Finally, Daniel whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't waste the chance." The judge nodded slowly. "I believe you won't." He paused, then looked down at his desk for a moment. "There's something else," he added. He reached into his robe pocket and took out a small box, an old keepsake from his father. Opening it, he pulled out a small brass pin with a simple design. "My father gave me this many years ago. He said it was a reminder to always respect those who've carried more than their share of the world's weight." He placed it on the desk in front of him. "I'd like you to have it, Mr. Brooks. It's not much, but it's a sign of respect, one man to another." Daniel stared at the pin, speechless. He didn't know what to do. Finally, he reached forward with trembling hands and picked it up. "I can't take this, sir," he said softly. "That belongs to you." The judge smiled faintly. "It belongs to anyone who remembers what honor means. And you've carried that longer than most." Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he nodded, his voice breaking slightly. "Thank you. I'll keep it safe." The judge sat back, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Brooks, you remind me why I chose this job in the first place, to see people, not just cases. Don't forget who you are. That medal on your jacket doesn't lose meaning because times got hard. You earned it and no one can take that away." Daniel nodded again, trying to steady himself. "I'll remember that, sir." The judge looked down at the papers one last time, then lifted his gaze. "Case dismissed," he said softly. The gavel struck the desk with a quiet echo that seemed to fill the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then the young defender reached out and gently touched Daniel's arm. "You did it," she whispered. He gave a faint smile, still dazed. The bailiff stepped forward, not to escort him out in cuffs, but to guide him toward the hallway. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Daniel stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He looked down at the judge's pin in his hand, and then at his old medal, both symbols of lives that had crossed paths in a way he never expected. He took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Inside the courtroom, Judge Hale watched through the tall windows as Daniel walked down the steps toward the street. The old soldier's back was still slightly bent, his clothes still worn, but there was something new in his stride, a quiet dignity returning. The judge stood there for a while, his thoughts heavy but peaceful. He knew the system couldn't fix everything, but maybe small acts of understanding could still make a difference. As he gathered his papers, he glanced once more at the empty spot where Daniel had stood and whispered to himself, "Sometimes justice isn't in the sentence, it's in the second chance." Outside, the day was growing brighter. Daniel paused at the edge of the courthouse steps, looked up at the sky and smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He tightened the medal on his jacket, slipped the judge's pin safely into his pocket, and took his first step toward a new beginning. The morning sun touched the courthouse steps as Daniel Brooks stood outside, holding the small brass pin that Judge Hale had given him. The light caught its surface, and it seemed to shine more brightly than it should have. For years, Daniel had walked through life unseen, a man with no home and no place to belong, but now something inside him had changed. He didn't know what waited for him beyond that building, but for the first time in a long while, he wanted to find out. He tucked the pin safely inside his jacket pocket next to the medal he had carried all those years. The two small pieces of metal felt heavier than before, not in weight but in meaning. They reminded him that even after all the pain, the world still held a bit of kindness. He took a deep breath and began walking slowly down the steps. A young woman was waiting near the sidewalk. She introduced herself softly. "Mr. Brooks? My name is Claire. I'm from the Veteran Support Program the judge mentioned. He called us earlier this morning." Her voice was gentle but confident. She wore a simple blue jacket with a small emblem on the sleeve. Daniel nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." The judge said someone might come. Claire smiled. He kept his promise. "We've arranged a temporary shelter for you at the community center. It's not far, about 10 minutes away. You'll have a bed, warm food, and some help with your paperwork. Would you like to go there now?" Daniel hesitated for a second. For years, he had been used to refusing offers like that. People meant well at first, but they often forgot. Still, something told him this time was different. "Yes," he said finally. "I think I'd like that." As they walked, the streets buzzed with the sound of cars and distant voices. The city was alive as always, but Daniel noticed things he hadn't before. The smell of bread from a bakery, the laughter of two children running past, a man feeding pigeons near the park. These were ordinary things, yet they felt new to him, like he was seeing the world for the first time again. Claire walked beside him quietly, only speaking when needed. "The judge asked us to keep him updated," she said after a while. "He said he'd like to know how you're doing." Daniel looked surprised. "He said that?" She nodded. "Yes, he told us you were someone who deserved another chance." Daniel smiled faintly. "I guess I never thought anyone would say that about me again." When they reached the community center, the building wasn't grand or fancy. It was small but clean, with white walls and a simple wooden sign out front. Inside, there were volunteers talking to people, handing out clothes and coffee. The air smelled faintly of soap and freshly cooked soup. A man behind the desk greeted them kindly. "You must be Mr. Brooks. We've been expecting you. Come on, let's get you settled." They gave him a small room at the back, just a single bed, a chair, and a table by the window. But to Daniel, it felt like a castle. The window looked out toward the trees, where sunlight filtered through the leaves. He sat on the bed slowly, running his hand across the clean blanket. It had been years since he'd had something this simple and peaceful. Claire placed a paper on the table. "Here's your schedule. Tomorrow we'll take you to the veterans' office to update your records. They'll help you apply for benefits and maybe even therapy if you want it." Daniel nodded quietly. "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would still want to help." She smiled kindly. "You'd be surprised, Mr. Brooks. Sometimes people just need to be reminded that you're still here." When she left, Daniel sat alone for a while, staring out the window. The world outside looked softer now. He thought about the judge, about the way he had looked at him. Not as a stranger, not as a case file, but as a man who had lived through something hard. He remembered the words the judge had said. "Justice has a heart." They stayed with him. Over the next few weeks, Daniel began to rebuild piece by piece. He started talking to other veterans at the shelter, men who had stories like his, stories of battles fought far from home and struggles faced afterward. They shared coffee in the mornings, traded small jokes, and sometimes sat together in silence when words weren't enough. One day, Claire came in smiling. "Guess what, Mr. Brooks? The housing office approved your application. You'll have your own apartment by next month." Daniel's eyes widened. "An apartment?" "Yes. It's part of a new veteran housing program. The rent will be covered until you're back on your feet." He was quiet for a long time before he said softly, "I don't even remember what it feels like to have my own key." "You'll remember," she said with a smile. "And when you move in, I'll bring a small plant. Everyone deserves something living to take care of." Daniel chuckled for the first time in a long while. "A plant, huh? I suppose I could manage that." That evening, as he sat by the window, he saw the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. He thought about all the nights he had spent under bridges, wishing for a day like this, a day when life didn't feel like a punishment. He whispered quietly to himself, "Maybe it's not too late." Weeks passed, and Daniel's strength began to return. He helped at the center whenever he could, fixing chairs, sweeping floors, and talking with new people who arrived looking as lost as he once had. He listened to them patiently and often told them, "You're not alone anymore." Those words came easily now because he finally believed them himself. One afternoon, as he was folding blankets, the receptionist approached him with a note. "Mr. Brooks, this came for you from the courthouse." He took the envelope carefully and opened it. Inside was a short handwritten letter from Judge Hale. It read, "Dear Mr. Brooks, I wanted to check on you and see how you are doing. The day you stood in my courtroom reminded me that justice isn't about rules. It's about remembering our shared humanity. You reminded me of that truth. I hope life is treating you kindly now. You have already proven your strength. Keep going one day at a time. With respect, Judge Richard Hale." Daniel read the letter twice, his throat tightening. He placed it gently on the table beside the medal and the small brass pin. Then he sat down, feeling something deep and warm in his chest, something that felt like peace. Months later, Daniel moved into his new apartment. It was small but filled with sunlight. On the table near the window sat the plant Claire had brought, a little green sprout growing stronger each week. Above it, hanging on the wall, were the two medals and the judge's pin, side by side. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Daniel would sit there with a cup of tea, looking out at the city lights. He still carried the same scars, the same memories, but now they didn't hurt as much. They were part of who he was. A man who had once been forgotten but found his way back because someone cared enough to look twice. And every Sunday morning, he took a walk past the courthouse steps. He would stop for a moment, look up at the tall windows, and smile faintly. He never went inside again, but he always felt the same quiet gratitude in his heart. The judge had not just given him freedom, he had given him back his dignity. As the seasons changed, Daniel began volunteering full-time at the center that had once saved him. He helped other veterans fill out forms, talked to those who couldn't sleep, and reminded them of the same truth that had brought him back. You're not forgotten. You still matter. Years later, when people at the center spoke about him, they didn't call him the homeless man who stood before a judge. They called him Mr. Brooks, the man who helps everyone find their second chance. And somewhere in another part of the city, Judge Hale kept that old file on his shelf, not as a record of a case, but as a reminder. On its cover, written in neat handwriting, were 3 words: "Compassion changes everything." The world had moved on, as it always does, but in one small corner of it, 2 men, a judge and a soldier, had quietly proved that kindness could still rebuild what life had broken. And in that truth, both of them found peace that would last the rest of their days.